In the heart of a small town in the Midwest lies an old cemetery that has been around for over a century. It's a peaceful place during the day, with tall trees providing shade and the occasional chirping of birds. But at night, it takes on a more ominous feel. There are many stories about the cemetery and the strange things that happen there. Some say that if you walk through the cemetery at night, you'll hear whispers and footsteps following you. Others claim that we've seen apparitions of people who were buried there, or that we've felt cold spots even on warm summer nights. But the most chilling story is the one who we, as a group of teenagers 10 years ago, decided to explore the cemetery one night. We were looking for a thrill, something to break up the monotony of our small town lives. We parked our cars outside the gates and hopped the fence, giggling nervously as we made our way through the graves. As we walked, we started to notice something strange. The cemetery was much larger than we had expected, and we seemed to be getting lost in the maze of graves and monuments. We had a flashlight, but it wasn't very bright, and the shadows seemed to be closing in around us. Just as we were about to turn back, we stumbled upon a small, old mausoleum. It was built into the side of a hill and looked like it hadn't been used in years. The door was slightly ajar, and we could see that the inside was pitch black. One of the boys, feeling brave, suggested that we explore the mausoleum. The others were hesitant, but eventually, we all agreed. We pushed the door open and stepped inside, shining our flashlight around the dark interior. At first, it seemed like there was nothing there. But as our eyes adjusted to the darkness, we saw that there were several coffins lined up against the walls. They were old and weathered, and some of them had broken lids. Suddenly, one of the girls let out a scream. She had spotted something in one of the coffins. As we all crowded around, we could see that there was a body inside, covered in a thin layer of dust. The group was horrified, and we all ran out of the mausoleum as fast as we could. As we were leaving, we noticed something strange. All of the graves and monuments seemed to be different than we had been just a few minutes before. The names and dates were unfamiliar, and the graves seemed to be much older. Panicking, the group scrambled to find their way out of the cemetery. But the harder we tried to leave, the more lost we seemed to become. We wandered around for what felt like hours, until finally, we stumbled upon the same mausoleum we had just fled from. The group was terrified, and we knew we had to get out of there as soon as possible. But as we were leaving, we heard a strange noise coming from the mausoleum. It was a faint scratching sound, like someone or something was trying to get out. The group never spoke of what happened that night, but we all knew that something had been watching us in the cemetery. And to this day, the mausoleum remains closed and off-limits to visitors. In the small town of Westview, nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, there was a cemetery that was rumored to be haunted. It was old and neglected, with weathered tombstones and overgrown grass. The locals avoided it at all costs, and it was said that anyone who entered the cemetery at night would never return. One summer evening, when I was still a student from Westview High School, a group of us had decided to explore the cemetery. We had heard the rumors and thought it would be fun to see if there was any truth to them. We parked our car outside the entrance gates and made our way inside. As we walked through the graveyard, we noticed that some of the tombstones were missing. We shrugged it off, assuming that they had been stolen or vandalized over the years. But as we walked further into the cemetery, we noticed something strange. The missing tombstones were not the only things that were amiss. Some of the graves looked freshly dug, and there were piles of dirt and shovels scattered throughout the cemetery. It looked as though someone had been digging up graves in the dead of night. Suddenly, we heard a noise coming from one of the graves. We approached it cautiously, shining our flashlights inside. To our horror, we saw a figure lying inside the grave. It was a man, dressed in a tattered suit and covered in dirt. The man sat up slowly, staring at us with wild eyes. He was disheveled and had a crazed look on his face. We were frozen with fear, not sure what to do. The man stood up and started to climb out of the grave. We turned and ran, screaming as we went. We could hear the man chasing us, his wild laughter echoing through the graveyard. We didn't stop running until we were outside the cemetery gates, gasping for breath. We looked back and saw the man standing at the gate, watching us with a sinister grin. The next day, the police were called to investigate the incident. We found evidence that the man had been digging up graves and stealing valuables from the corpses. He had been living in the cemetery for weeks, hiding from the law and using the stolen goods to survive. The man was identified as Carl Johnson, a former resident of Westview who had disappeared years ago. He had been declared dead and buried, but it appeared that he had faked his own death and had been living in the cemetery ever since. The police also found evidence that Johnson was not alone in the graveyard. We discovered a network of tunnels and hiding places beneath the graves, indicating that there were others who had been living there as well. The cemetery was cleaned up and the man was arrested, but we never forgot our terrifying encounter. We knew that this place held secrets and dangers that were hard to understand. We often wondered how many others were hiding in there, waiting to be discovered. The incident left a deep impression on us, and we never went back to the cemetery again. It was a cold autumn evening, and the leaves rustled under my feet as I walked down the dark and deserted path towards the old cemetery. The sky was pitch black, and the only light came from the full moon, casting eerie shadows on the graves. I had heard stories about this cemetery, about how it was haunted by the ghosts of those who were buried there, and how strange things happened at night. But I didn't believe in such things. I was just there to pay my respects to my late grandfather. As I made my way through the graveyard, I noticed that some of the graves had been vandalized. The headstones were knocked over and the flowers that had been left there were trampled on. It made me feel uneasy, but I kept walking. I reached my grandfather's grave and knelt down to place some flowers on it. That's when I heard a faint sound, like someone was digging in the ground. I looked around, but I couldn't see anyone. It was quiet again, so I assumed it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again, louder this time. I stood up and looked around, and that's when I saw it. A figure was digging up a grave a few feet away from me. It was too dark to see their face, but I could tell we were a man. I was about to run away when he stopped digging and looked up at me. He had a sinister smile on his face, and I could tell that he wasn't a grave robber, but something far worse. He started walking towards me, and I panicked. I turned and ran as fast as I could, but he was right behind me. I could hear his footsteps getting closer and closer. I was about to reach the entrance of the cemetery when I tripped and fell to the ground. He caught up to me and grabbed my arm, pulling me towards him. He smelled like rotting flesh and his grip was so tight that it hurt. I screamed for help, but there was no one around to hear me. He leaned in close to my ear and whispered, "You shouldn't have come here. This is my cemetery, and you're not welcome." I tried to break free from his grasp, but it was no use. He dragged me towards an open grave, and I knew that he was going to bury me alive. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. Just then, I heard a loud sound coming from the entrance of the cemetery. It was the sound of a police siren. The man let go of me and ran away into the darkness. The police arrived a few minutes later and took a statement from me. We searched the cemetery, but we couldn't find the man who had attacked me. He told me that it was best to leave and come back with caution if I have to be here again. As I walked away from the cemetery, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I turned around, but there was no one there. I was relieved, but also scared that the man might come back for me. From that day on, I never went back to that cemetery again. I learned that there are some places that should be avoided, and that sometimes, the scariest things aren't ghosts or ghouls, but the people who live among us. Please support me by smashing the like button and subscribing to my channel. Turn on all notifications for new upcoming videos. Please leave a comment on what other stories you like to hear.